Hi, this is Barry Loveland. I'm the chair of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project. And I was going to share some information with you today about the early history of activism in Central Pennsylvania, um, specifically in the Harrisburg area, activism in the LGBTQ community. Some of the earliest activism happened back in the 1960s, and Harrisburg's first gay activist is considered to be Richard Schlegel, who was born in Barrysburg, just north of Harrisburg, in 1927. He graduated from Penn State in 1949 and went on to get a master's degree at American University in Washington. He also then went to work for the federal government for the Civil Aeronautics Administration, which is now the FAA, in 1952. And Richard got rapidly promoted in his job to higher level positions and getting security clearances along the way. But this was a time when Senator Joe McCarthy was holding hearings in the Congress to try to rid the government of suspected communists, but also suspected homosexuals. And that was called the Lavender Scare. And so as part of that effort, Richard was investigated and was suspected of being gay, and there were officials who trailed him and came to the conclusion that he was gay. And so he lost his job in 1961, and he sued for reinstatement. And his case went all the way to the US Supreme Court, where he eventually lost. But there was a whole series of people in government who had problems like Richard, but Richard fought his case, and at least he made an effort to get his job back. Richard then decided to move back home to live with his parents, who were then living in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Along the way, he applied for a job with state government in Pennsylvania and got hired as director of finance for the Pennsylvania Department of Highways, which is now PennDOT. That was in 1963, and he moved to Harrisburg. In the course of his job, he was getting a lot of praise for his work. His job performance was excellent. He was making significant contributions to reducing costs and the highway construction costs and budgets and so forth. And he was traveling around the state, and one of the places he would frequently travel to was Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, the Janus Society had just formed, which was one of the earliest gay organizations in Philadelphia and in the East Coast of the U.S. And so attending some meetings there, they were very interested in the fact that he lived in Harrisburg and that he was in state government. And they thought that it might be good if they could have a Central Pennsylvania chapter started, which would enable them to get a foothold into the possibility of lobbying and trying to convince officials of state government to make or pass non-discrimination laws for LGBTQ people. So we started a Central Pennsylvania chapter of the Janus Society in 1965. So in 1965, it was the first gay organization documented in Central Pennsylvania. The group started meeting in Richard Schlegel's apartment that he rented at 205 State Street. So in the course of that, the Janus Society's publication, The Drum, listed him as a contact person for this new Central PA chapter, and that drew the attention of postal inspectors. And so inspectors alerted the state officials in state government, that he was a member and coordinator of this group. And there was an investigation by state police, and then Richard was unfortunately fired again from his government position, this time in the state, in the summer of 1965. Around this time was also a number of police raids in the city in the summer of 1965. Richard kind of witnessed this whole thing unfold from his apartment, where there were raids of men on State Street and at the Clock Bar, which we'll talk about in another segment, as one of the early gay bars in Harrisburg. And that was the direction of the newly elected county DA, Leroy Zimmerman, who would eventually go on to become the state attorney general. There were 26 men and 1 juvenile that were arrested as part of the raids. The Clock Bar was closed. The names were published in the newspaper, and many careers were ruined and families disowned. Members of their family that were a part of this caught up in this. And at least 1 man was known to have committed suicide as a result of the prosecutions. Richard, at that point, when he lost his position, he went on to move to Washington for a while, and then settled in Philadelphia for quite a few years, and had a career in finance and accounting, and he invested well, and he ended up retiring to his family home in Lewisburg, and he actually set up a family foundation, which has benefited our LGBT history project quite a bit in getting grants from that foundation. So the next generation of activists came along in the 1970s, and Jerry Brennan was one of the leaders of the group of activists in Harrisburg. Jerry was born in Shamokin in 1943. He spent summers visiting friends of his in New York City, and in the summer of '69, he was told there's something going on here at Stonewall Bar, and you need to get up here right away and see what's going on. So Jerry, although Jerry wasn't involved in the Stonewall riots, he was involved in many of the meetings that happened after that, and with the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance. He ended up moving to Harrisburg in 1972, and the Stonewall riots and the activism meetings that were happening in New York had a big impact on him, and he decided in 1973 that he wanted to start a gay organization in Harrisburg. The gay organization, by the way, Janus Society, folded pretty much right after Richard left Harrisburg, so it didn't last very long. But Jerry started Gay Community Services in Harrisburg, which started out as a gay discussion group, but then became 2 separate organizations in 1975. Dignity Central Pennsylvania and the Gay Switchboard of Harrisburg. The Dignity was affiliated with a national Dignity organization that was for gay Catholics and their friends. The Switchboard was one of a number of switchboards throughout the country that provided information and peer counseling and services to people in the local community. So Dignity Central Pennsylvania, again, a chapter of the national group, became kind of the primary social organization. And you can see one of the summer picnics there depicted in one photograph there on the top. There were a lot of people who got involved in Dignity because it became pretty much the only game in town in terms of an organization that you could actually go and do activities with and so forth outside of the gay bars. The Gay Switchboard, which was later renamed the Gay and Lesbian Switchboard of Harrisburg, provided a lot of valuable services to the community. It was a way for people to connect with the community, find out about what events were happening, where the gay bars were, businesses that cater to gay people and services and organizations and so on. So in the 1970s also, one of the things that that happened was that Governor Shapp had taken, had been elected governor, and in 1974, there were a couple of activists in Philadelphia who decided that it was time to try to work at the state level and try to see if there was anything could be done to eliminate discrimination in employment and other housing and other services for gay people, and to see if a statewide law could be enacted. So Mark Siegel and one other activist wrote to Governor Shapp from Philadelphia, and they were asking if he would be willing to meet with them, and Shapp agreed. And it was the first known documented meeting between a sitting governor and gay activists anywhere in the country. And from that meeting, they had requested that Shapp convene a task force of people who would try to improve public policy for LGBTQ people. So Shapp agreed to start a task force that would include representatives from the community, as well as representatives from state government agencies. And so in 1965, he issued his first executive order prohibiting discrimination for employment for state employees. It only involves state employees, not employees of other private firms and so forth throughout the state, but and it was based on sexual orientation. That was the first state in the United States to offer any kind of protections for its state employees. California was the second state to do so in 1978. In 1976, Governor Shapp formalized the task force into an organization called the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, the first governmental body in the US that was dedicated to improving public policy for LGBT people. And in 1976, he also issues the first Gay Pride Week proclamation, the first governor in the United States to do that. So Shapp was following through on a number of initiatives that were quite unusual and quite advanced for the time. As part of the meetings of the task force, there were a number of people from the rural parts of the state that decided to form a caucus, as it were, and they called it the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. And the caucus started organizing in 1975 with the first statewide gay conference, which was held in Harrisburg. And in 1976, the caucus held the first ever Gay Education Day, or Lobby Day, to lobby the legislature for non-discrimination protections for LGBT people. And in 1977, the caucus held the first gay rights demonstration in Harrisburg. And you can see in the images there are some images from a newsletter about the Education Day or Lobby Day, and then the gay rights demonstration in the photograph down below, which was held adjacent to the Capitol grounds. There were activists, other activists in the 1970s. Mary Nan Caro was born in Harrisburg, became active in the governor's task force and the caucus. While a student at Shippensburg, she moved back to Harrisburg after graduating from Shippensburg University and worked for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. She also became active in the National Organization for Women and eventually rose to become the state president of that chapter. Mary became involved in local gay and lesbian activism, including the successful effort to pass a non-discrimination ordinance in the city of Harrisburg in 1983. She led that effort along with a number of other people in the community. In the 1980s, Lorraine Kajawa got involved in the lesbian community. She was born in Brooklyn moved with her family to Pennsylvania, and then took a teaching job in Harrisburg. And so she was looking around for activities for women, women's community, found very little, so she decided to start a calendar and newsletter for the lesbian community. And often a number of women would get together and just plan out events for like potlucks and events, hiking and things like that, that would be published in the calendar just to see if they would get any response. And lo and behold, they did get a lot of response. And the women's community really flourished as part of the efforts that she had in publicizing events throughout Central PA. In the 1980s, also, there was the advent of the AIDS epidemic. South Central AIDS Assistance Network was created by Roger Beatty and Frank Pizzoli, who each of them began gathering volunteers and holding meetings, not knowing what the other was doing, but eventually finding out. And then there was a merging of the two small groups into one organization, which was then incorporated as SCAN in 1986. And there's a picture of Roger. And there was a lot of money that needed to be raised for the activities of this organization, helping AIDS patients. And there was a number of AIDS walks that were organized, but also there were other fundraisers by the LGBT community, including the Unity Festival, which was an annual fundraiser for a few years, that was organized by Nikki Nur, who at first volunteered her own property to hold the festival, and then it was moved to Ski Round Top for a couple of years and raised a substantial amount for the SCAN organization. Also, Lily White and Company was a drag troupe that was founded by Paul Foltz, and that company raised, I think, well over $100,000 over about a 8 or 10 year period from the 80s through the 90s for HIV/AIDS and also other LGBTQ groups. In the 90s, there was a number of activists that came out as a new generation of activism. Dan Miller was one of those people who had came out by being on television, talking about a series of gay bashings that were happening in Harrisburg at the time. He ended up losing his job over that, was sued by his former employer for taking business away. He started his own CPA firm and took some of the clients with him. Dan became an activist with the Gay and Lesbian Switchboard, then the Pennsylvania Justice Campaign, which was a statewide group to try to affect non-discrimination laws. And then he also was one of the people who started the Gay and Lesbian Pride Festival of Central Pennsylvania that continues today. And later, Dan got elected to city council and then controller of Harrisburg and now treasurer of Harrisburg. Dr. Eric Selvey was another one who came to activism in the 1990s. He was active in Lily White and Company's drag troupe, joining the board there and helping to manage some of their fundraising. Eric got appointed the first openly gay chair of the Harrisburg Human Relations Commission. And he also chaired several of the Pride festivals after Dan relinquished those to others to run. And Eric also started a magazine around that time called Crossroads Magazine, which was an LGBTQ publication, and he was the editor and publisher of that. And then into the 21st century, yet another generation of activism. There was the founding of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, which happened in the early 2000s. And then the founding of Trans Central PA, a transgender group by Janine Roussan. And Joanne Carroll also became very active in that group and rose to become its next president, and has been active throughout the Harrisburg area as well as throughout the state on many boards and organizations, and as a transgender activist and advocate. And also Mara Kiesling, who was another person who lived in Harrisburg and went through her transgender process here, who then went on to Washington, D.C. to found the National Center for Transgender Equality. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the history of LGBTQ activism through the decades in Harrisburg. And we've been documenting this history through the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project. The History Project has been active for about 9 years, and we do oral histories, and we collect materials that help tell the story and the history of this LGBTQ community here in Central Pennsylvania. And our contact information is on the screen there. If anyone is interested in either becoming a volunteer with the project or in getting interviewed for our oral history project, or perhaps donating materials such as archival materials, documents, photographs, or artifacts, we would be very happy to talk with you. Thank you.